We're at the Nashville Repertory Theater costume shop today, and we're talking about how to sew on a button. So there are three main types of buttons that you're going to encounter and have to sew on things. So you have buttons with 2 holes, buttons with 4 holes, and then buttons that are called the shank buttons that from the front don't have any holes at all, but from the back there's this little thing called a shank for the thread to go through. So this is a shank button. Another example is a lot of covered buttons are shank buttons, so you'll see that on the back. And even this button that has a little channel in the back that isn't quite the same as the others is a shank button because it doesn't have any holes from the front. So next, after you select your buttons, you're going to prepare your fabric. So I have marked on my fabric where each of my buttons is going to go. The most important thing with this is that you want your buttons to sit at least 1/4 inch away from the edge of your fabric, wherever they need to go to match up with the buttonhole that they're going through. So you'll see I've done that with each of my buttons here, and that they're at least 1/4 inch away from the edge. So next you're going to select your thread. So you can use regular all-purpose thread for this that you get at like Joann's or Hobby Lobby or Michael's. You can also use silamide. We talked about this in our hand sewing video. Silamide is a pre-cut and pre-waxed thread that's specifically made for hand sewing. It is a little more specialty. You can get this at places like wallwalk.com, manhattanwardrobesupply.com, or on Amazon. It's just a little more specialty. You can also use button thread. Now, button thread is similar to all-purpose thread in that you can get it at, Joann's or Michael's. It's just a little heavier duty and it's a little thicker. So you'll find that if you do use button thread, that you'll have to go around your buttons less times to make them as secure. But we're going to be using all-purpose thread today. I have my needle threaded here in the same way that we talked about in our hand sewing video. I have my all-purpose thread doubled over and I have a knot at the end, and I've run my thread over some beeswax. We're going to do our shank button first, so I'm going to pick up my fabric in my non-dominant hand. I'm going to make sure my shank is going up and down according to my marking, and I'm going to hold that there with my non-dominant hand and pick up my needle, and I'm going to go from the back up through the fabric, pull that through. Oh, it looks like I need to tie another knot in my thread. So if that happens to you, if your needle pulls through, you're going to tie a couple more knots in your thread to make that knot a little bit thicker so it won't pull through. And I'll trim this off when I'm done later. So again, pick up your needle and your fabric and hold it there. Go up from the back, right on the cross of your marking. Pull through, go through your button side to side, and down again, so you can even let your button go a little bit if you need to. Put down through on the other side of your marking. Pull your button, and then you're gonna do this, 5 or 6 times maybe. Come up through your fabric and your button. Go back down at the same place. And you're going to continue doing that, pulling your thread taut until your button feels nice and sturdy. You don't want it to be pulling off your fabric or anything, of course, because then your button's loose and it might come off. Want to make sure your thread doesn't get wrapped around your button because that can lead to some tangles. So my button feels pretty sturdy on here. I don't actually know how many times I've gone around, but to tie it off, we're going to do the same thing we talked about in our hand sewing video. I'm going to take my needle, I'm going to put it through, one of my stitches. I'm going to twist my loop once. I'm gonna put my needle back through it, and I'm gonna pull that knot down, and I'm gonna do that probably one more time just to make sure my button is secure. And again, if you want to review this, we talked about this in our hand sewing basics video as well. So twist that loop, feed the needle back through, and pull that down. You can also, if your tail is long enough, just tie it a couple times to each other. So yep, after you clip off your threads, then you're done with your button. Buttons with holes are a little different. So if you look at a shank button, you can see that there's this space here between the button and the fabric that the shank provides. That is the space where, if you think about the buttonhole on the other side of the fabric, that fabric and that buttonhole do have a little bit of bulk to them, and you need space in your button for that fabric to go. That's what the shank on a shank button provides, and on a button with holes, we need to provide that manually. So what I like to do is to put something between my fabric and my button. You can use a toothpick. I've used a little bit of rolled up paper here. So you're gonna put that on your mark. You're gonna hold your button over top of it. This can be a lot to kind of hold on to. So I like to sometimes, just put a pin in there as well to help hold that initially. So I have my thread in my dominant hand and my button in my fabric in my other hand. I'm going to come up through from the back, just over my button and just around my pin. And that little piece of paper in there, or that toothpick or whatever, makes it so that I can pull it tight, but still that later there will be some room in there. I'm going to take my pin out now so it's not in my way. And we're gonna, again, go around until it feels pretty sturdy. That's feeling pretty good to me. So I'm gonna take out, whatever I have in there, and I'm not gonna pull my stitches tight, but I'm gonna put my needle up through next to where my other stitches were, and just loosely out. Make sure you don't have any loops though. And then we're going to wrap around these other stitches that we made. And this is making a shank on the button, similar to the one on a shank button, but without having the shank built in. So after you wrap around a few times and pull it kind of tight around those stitches, you're going to go back down, and we're going to tie off on the back like we did on our other button. So we sewed our 4-hole button very similarly to our 2-hole button. So we went around the top 2 holes several times, the bottom 2 holes several times, and then we made that thread shank by putting our needle back up through the fabric and wrapping it around all of the threads several times, pulling it tight, putting the needle back through, and tying a knot on the back. So you can kind of see even, where my first set of stitches were and one set of stitches were and my other set of stitches, and the thread going between them and the knot. So that is how you sew a button.